Hello, and welcome to Eastside Stories. My name is Michael Lewis. This is the fourth in a series of video presentations brought to you by the Eastside Heritage Center, covering the history of the East Side. For those of you not familiar with the East Side, it consists of a number of communities to the east of Seattle on the other side of Lake Washington, including Bellevue, Redmond, Kirkland, and Issaquah. When we left off at our last presentation, the East Side had started to grow. It was growing slowly, but as Seattle began to grow in the wake of the Klondike Gold Rush, the East Side started to pick up speed. Now, the early settlers on the East Side were mostly adventurers and speculators, people who went to look for coal, cut down trees, and hew the logs into lumber. Gradually, families began to make their way over, and they purchased land often from the original homesteaders. Now, when you had families, of course you had children, and children need schools. Homeschooling, as we would know it today, was simply not a very practical alternative. Many of the parents themselves wouldn't have been particularly well educated, plus they were working all day on their farms or in the coal mines and doing other kinds of work. Many of them were foreign immigrants for whom English was not their first language. So they had to build schools. Now, these early schools were often just simply log cabins out in the woods with just a handful of students, sometimes maybe 2 or 3 families only and a handful of kids. The teacher was often a local student who just themselves graduated from school, maybe someone's older brother or sister. Here's one of the early log cabin schools. This is the first Redmond school. It was built in 1875. The teacher on the right is Ed Turner. The school operated from 1875 until about 1887. Next, we see an early school in the Beaux-Arts neighborhood, toward the southwest part of Bellevue. This school also serves some students from across the water in Mercer Island. There were also early log cabin schools in Factoria, Highland, Phantom Lake and Maidenbower areas around Bellevue, in Happy Valley, in Juanita, and really throughout the East Side as families were settling. These earliest schools were really community undertakings. Families would gather together and build the school building. Find a teacher somewhere, often the teacher would board with one of the families. It's a pretty simple operation where they would simply collect the money among themselves to make it work. Now, when statehood came along and the state defined school districts and gave them taxing authority, these communities could create a school district, and then they would have the ability to tax the residents to pay for the school, and most importantly, to be able to bond, to borrow money to build more elaborate buildings. So what we saw, more bigger buildings spring up around the East Side. The oldest school district on the East Side, the first one that formed, was in Houghton, on the shores of Lake Washington, south of Kirkland. This picture shows the area what's now around Carillon Point, and you can see the Houghton School in the background. Quite a nice building. Bellevue finally opened a permanent school on Main Street in 1892. It had 2 rooms. It was located on Main Street just about where 100th Avenue comes down, where the Chevron station is today. Now here's the Kirkland Central School in 1902, the building on the right. Now that's getting to be a fairly large building, but of course Kirkland was the most prosperous and elaborate community on the East Side at the time and had the resources to build a larger building with architecture very similar to what you would have seen in Seattle schools at that time. Here's an interior picture from the school in Happy Valley to the east of Redmond. Interior pictures in schools are actually fairly rare. Most of what we get are pictures of students standing outside of schools, but this gave you some idea of what the insides look like with the rows of desks. Here's Redmond School in 1909. See, schools are starting to get a little bit bigger with multiple classrooms, multiple stories. Now, the Points communities originally didn't have any schools at all, so students from the north part of the Points communities would go to Houghton or Kirkland. In the south part, they would head to Bellevue. But they got together and built some schools, both opening in 1909. For the north part of the Points communities, here's Bay School. That was located right where the Hunts Point City Hall is today. To the south, Medina School opened in 1909 also on 84th Avenue at 10th Street. And these were both separate districts operating with just one building. Finally, here's the Highland School out in the middle part of Bellevue with all of the students in 1914. For the most part, these were elementary schools. At that time, students went to school only maybe till 8th grade. School was compulsory, but most students didn't go to high school. They were working on farms mostly, and when a child got to be of an age where they could be helpful on the farm and their parents figured, well, they probably learned as much as they need to know, they would stop going to school. Now, some students did go to high school, but high schools were not widespread. So you'll see in some of the pictures students who are obviously older, obviously high school age, and they could continue to go to school there, but the instruction wouldn't really be what they needed. The only real high school early on was in Kirkland. So students from anywhere within a reasonable distance of Kirkland could attend that school, including parts of Redmond, the Points communities. Otherwise, students went to school at their local school and hoped to get the best education they could. Along the shores of Lake Washington, they had the option of going to Seattle. And many students from the Points communities in the southern part of Bellevue and Mercer Island took a ferry across to either Leschi or Madison Park. Early on, they would attend Broadway High School. The building is still there as part of the Seattle Central College campus. Later, when Garfield and Franklin high schools were built, many students went to those schools. Now, with the coming of more students and more families and really more revenue in the community, we started to get some more elaborate buildings. Here's Redmond High School. It was built in the early part of the 20th century, and this shows it around 1920. Here's the Bellevue Elementary School. This was built in 1920 and really didn't last very long. There was a new school built shortly after that in what's now the downtown Bellevue Park. And here we have Medina School, built in 1924 after the original wooden building burned down. And Bellevue finally got a high school in 1930, the Union S High School. The way the Union schools worked is a number of these smaller districts that just had elementary schools would pool their resources to build a single high school that all of their students could attend. This high school was located where the downtown Bellevue Park is now. It was originally Union S High School, then Bellevue High School, then Bellevue Junior High School, and then was finally the first campus of Eastside Catholic School. So what began to evolve in the early part of the 20th century was a patchwork of small school districts across the east side. Many of them operated only one building, some operated two buildings. There were only a couple of high schools, and these little districts really weren't quite up to the task that was facing them as the region began to grow. So the districts began to consolidate. 6 districts combined to form the Bellevue School District in 1942, and 3 districts combined to form the Lake Washington School District in 1944. Now these districts, in addition to Issaquah, would really form the backbone of growth around the east side into the 1950s and beyond, when housing began to be built in earnest and the population began to grow. Schools were always a big selling point for moving to the east side and continue to be today. In our next program, we'll talk about building roads. That was always a challenge in the wilderness. Roads are expensive to build, they're complicated, they require land, and there was an interesting process through which citizens could petition and have a road built, and we'll talk about that in the next program. So thank you for watching. We hope you've enjoyed the program. We also hope you'll visit our website and consider making a contribution to support the work of the Eastside Heritage Center.